Hello, so about a year ago I made a video analysing other creators' choices for top 10 perfumes for life, and I tried to find the ultimate consensus list. So now a year later I'm doing this again, and I'm just going to compare it with last year and see if anything's changed. Is the number one still guidance? Let's find out. So if you've not seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I'm a scientist in real life, and I think I come at fragrance on YouTube from a slightly different angle to a lot of people. I am very analytical as a person, and I like doing these kinds of meta-analyses basically of other people's data to try to find the trends and patterns that we see overall in YouTube. And I just find it really interesting. I've done a similar video to this looking at decluttering and looking at the most decluttered fragrances in people's perfume collections. And that equally had some really great insights into the world of perfume YouTube. So if you are interested in that video, I'm going to leave that link down below, as well as last year's top 10 consensus for life list. So if this kind of thing does interest you, then please do consider subscribing, and please also like this video if you do end up enjoying this kind of content. So first of all, just because I'm a scientist, let's look at my methods first, because you can't tell anything about a dataset without seeing how that dataset was collected. So I've collected data over the last 12 months approximately, so all the way back from the 16th of April 2024 right up to the 22nd of March 2025, and I've analysed 25 videos in total, and those were from 24 different creators. Interestingly, there was one creator who had made 2 videos within that 12-month period, and what I did was I took their choices and deduplicated them. In actual fact, in those top 10 for life videos, there was only one perfume that was in common between those 2 videos. So there wasn't much to deduplicate, which I think is really striking, isn't it? As influencers, their tastes tend to move on quite quickly. So I identified those videos by searching for 10 perfumes for life and then ordering by most recent, and then watching every single video in that feed featuring at least one female marketed fragrance. So from those 25 videos, there were 250 fragrances in total that were identified. And you'd expect that because you'd expect 10 per video, but that wasn't actually the case. A lot of creators didn't choose 10 per video. They chose 9 or they chose 12, and actually one chose 5. But I included all of those videos, even if they weren't exactly 10. Why are creators not choosing 10? It's because 10 is a common search, and so creators title these videos as top 10 for life, even if they're choosing 5 or they're choosing 12 or they're choosing 9. When I compared this year's dataset to last year's dataset, I realised that there are actually a lot fewer videos, and I wondered why. And the reasons I've thought of for that are that people are perhaps titling their videos slightly differently to how they've titled them in the past. So I've seen a trend this year of videos going towards things like top 20 for life or the best 50 fragrances in my collection. And that might suggest that creators are getting ever larger perfume collections, and that 10 is just too difficult for them to try to select. Also, for this video, I looked at content over a 12-month time period approximately, whereas last year I looked at a time period of around 13 months. Another thing that creators tend to do is that they title their video as top 10 for life in their thumbnail, but perhaps they use different search terms in their description box, and that might also be a reason why I'm not finding as many videos. Ironically, after I just finished collecting the dataset, I saw another video that didn't come up in my search, but that had that title in the thumbnail. So I am clearly missing some data here. So next I looked at the sizes of the channels that were making these videos, and there was a really big spread. So channels ranged all the way from 38 subscribers to 358,000 subscribers. The median channel size was 18.7 thousand, and actually out of the 24 creators, 12 creators had a channel size of 20,000 subscribers or over, which suggests to me that those channels may be receiving significant amounts of PR. And that's important for us to realise, because top 10 lists rely on the fragrances that an influencer actually owns. And if an influencer doesn't own that fragrance, they can't include it in their list. So PR might be having a very significant effect on the overall results of these lists. I next tried to look at the geographical location of channels to see really how well the world is being covered by these videos. Actually, over 50% of channels making these videos, around 13 of the videos, were made by channels based within the US. But the UK was the second most commonly identified country, along with Canada. Also represented were the United Arab Emirates, Poland, and also Switzerland. Of the 24 channels that I did look at, I could not identify the geographical location of 2 of those channels, so this isn't a complete dataset. Really, what I'm saying here is that the top 10 for life list is heavily influenced by US channels, and that is going to be important because, again, the fragrances that you put in your top 10 are going to be the fragrances that you have available to you, and that's going to be mainly brands that sell within the US, within the UK, and within Canada. So next, which were the most mentioned brands in these lists? So there were 16 brands in total with 4 or more mentions within these lists. So in 10th equal spot were BDK, Diptyque, Fragrance du Bois, Nichane, Mugler, and Tom Ford. For BDK, Rouge Smoking was really helping it to get on this list. It was mentioned twice. For Diptyque, it was L'Eau Papier, which is a relatively new fragrance. For Kilian, it was Princess, a classic. And for Nichane, it was unsurprisingly Annie, which I think is a vanilla which is particularly loved. And for Tom Ford, it was the classic fragrance Tobacco Vanille, which did very well in our lists last year. Each of those fragrances received 2 mentions each, but there were other fragrances that were mentioned from those brands for a total of 4 mentions each per brand. Fragrance du Bois mentions and also Mugler's mentions were much more diverse, with 4 different fragrances being highlighted by influencers. In 6th equal spot, with 5 mentions each, were Amouage, riding the high of Guidance, also Galan. Ironically, all mentions were from the Art and Materials collection. Also featured with 5 mentions were Initio and also Une Nuit Nomade. The presence of Une Nuit Nomade really surprised me in this list. They're not a brand that I would generally associate with being a very big brand, and I was shocked to see them with 5 mentions. In 5th place were Chanel this year. Last year, Chanel came top of the brand list, and that was basically because one particular influencer mentioned them very heavily in their top 10 lists. Also last year, Coromandel got mentioned a lot, and this year I only saw it once. So I think that maybe people have just moved on to other fragrances. It's just not quite so in vogue this year. In 3rd equal spot were MFK, Maison Francis Kurkdjian, and also Dior. So I feel I should give MFK really the 3rd spot, and I should put Dior in 4th because actually MFK were mentioned by a 1/3 of the channels making these lists. They had 8 mentions, whereas Dior were mentioned by only 6 influencers making these lists, meaning only 1/4 of influencers mentioned Dior. So Xerjoff actually came second with 9 separate mentions by 8 different influencers. And the fragrances that were mentioned most were La Capitale and also Starlight, with 2 mentions each. There were other Xerjoff fragrances mentioned, which were more diverse. It was quite a wide spread of Xerjoff fragrances, but those 2 were the only 2 with 2 mentions each. So the number 1 brand, can you guess? So last year they were in 6th position, but this year they're number 1. It's Parfums de Marly. They were mentioned a massive 13 times by 10 different influencers on YouTube. The mentions for this brand really hinge around 3 separate lines, but more about that later. So given that list, if we now look at the conglomerate brands, so the brands that own those perfume brands, which conglomerate is doing the best overall? So if we look at the parent brands of the top 16 choices, many are actually independent brands, but the parent company that's coming out on top is LVMH for the 2nd year running. They have 21 mentions. So LVMH own Dior, MFK and also Guerlain, and that's why they're riding so high. But not far behind them were Advent, who own Initio and also Parfums de Marly. They had 18 separate mentions. Next up, L'Oreal had 9 mentions, Estée Lauder had 8 mentions, and Chanel had 7. So I'm not really surprised by LVMH winning this battle again this year. LVMH are the largest beauty brand out there, so I'm not surprised. But what I am surprised by is the dominance of Advent. So yeah, considering they're challenging LVMH to the top spot, I think that's really astounding. The market in fragrance is clearly moving very quickly. I'd also like to point out here that compared to last year, the mentions of Middle Eastern fragrances in these lists was really much lower. And this year, I only found that Middle Eastern fragrances were mentioned a total of 7 times out of 250 choices. And the brands mentioned were Lattafa, Kalaj, Paris Corner, and also Al Haramain. As a percentage of the 250 fragrances, that accounts for around 2.8% of the total. So next, what is the actual top 10 for life consensus list? So when I looked at the different fragrances that were mentioned, there were loads of fragrances that were mentioned twice each. And there were around 27 different fragrances that were mentioned twice. So that means we effectively have to do a top 33 here. So let's just look at the fragrances that were mentioned twice each. I'm just going to leave the list here and I'm going to change it over halfway through so you can take a good long look at it and read all of these fragrances because this list is long. So in fact, all of those fragrances are in joint 7th place. So all of those 27 are in joint 7th. I think the thing that stood out for me from this initial list was that Chanel Coco Mademoiselle, Tobacco Vanille from Tom Ford, and also Spiritueuse Double Vanille from Guerlain were on last year's list. Those seem to be enduring classics that are picked both in 2024 and in 2025 by creators. And those are older fragrances. So those are maybe ones that are here to stay in these lists. Also notice that the vote for Guidance has been split this year. So last year, Guidance was the #1 fragrance. So we are going to crown a new champion here. The vote for Guidance has been split because of the release of Guidance 46. So a similar thing happened with Delina and Delina Exclusive last year. And that meant that Guidance won overall. Last year, Guidance got 7 mentions and Guidance and Guidance 46 overall are only getting 4 mentions. So it's clear that really influencers have moved on from mentioning Guidance quite so much, perhaps because they feel that the audience are perhaps tiring of Guidance slightly from them having hyped it so much in 2024. Notably in this list, Parfums de Marly have 2 fragrances with 2 mentions each. Those are Oriana and also Valleya. Notice that Valleya Exclusive is not yet on these lists. And also Xerjoff has 2 separate mentions, both Starlight and La Capitale, and those are both vanilla-based fragrances. Vanilla is very important in these lists. You will see lots of vanilla fragrances. So next, let's look at the second place fragrances with 3 mentions each. So we've got a tie here. We've got a 5-way tie for second. And we can interpret this list in different ways because the vote has been split for Delina and Delina Exclusive. So if you add their mentions together, they get 6, which would actually mean that they would win overall. But because they've released that flanker, they're not winning. It's interesting too here that actually Delina La Rosée also got 1 mention. So overall they would have 7 mentions just for the Delina line. And that really shows Parfums de Marly's massive success and massive dominance of the YouTube influencer market. I was actually quite surprised to still see Baccarat Rouge 540 on these lists. In fact, Baccarat Rouge 540 Extrait was also mentioned by 1 influencer. So that takes their total mentions to 4. But the 3 being shown here of the standard Baccarat Rouge, you know, that's a really quite old fragrance now, but it still has a lot of love in the community and it's still charting as a second equal fragrance on this list. Also notice that Musk Therapy from Initio has 3 mentions. So last year it was Atomic Rose that was doing well for Initio, although Musk Therapy and also Narcotic Delight did get some mentions for them last year. But this year as well, Initio also had some mentions for Narcotic Delight and also Side Effect. Dior had the highest charting mainline mainstream designer fragrance with Hypnotic Poison. And this really stood out because Hypnotic Poison is a classic fragrance now. This has been out a while. And last year, the highest rating designer fragrance was Alien by Mugler. And I think this is really showing you the sea change in tastes on YouTube. Vanilla now seems to be the dominant note in these top 10 for life lists. Okay, so this is the big one. Can you guess the #1 fragrance from these lists? Have a go. This one really shocked me. I'll be surprised if anybody ever thinks that this is going to be the number one. So it's actually a fragrance from Une Nuit Nomade. So I was saying earlier about how surprised I was to see this as one of the biggest brands, because it's something I don't tend to hear about too much. But Une Nuit Nomade seems to have had a massive hit with Jardin de Misfa. And that one seems to be the one that is loved most. So that had 4 mentions by 4 different YouTubers overall. Une Nuit Nomade had a total of 5 mentions in total from different influencers. And actually one influencer did mention that one of their other fragrances was one of their favourites. And they chose Estrella de la Mañana. I have to say that Jardin de Misfa does seem to be universally loved. Whenever I watch a sampling video from Une Nuit Nomade, that usually comes out on top, along with 1 or 2 others. That does seem to be the one that is likeable. I think really it's a sweet fragrance, isn't it? It's a date-based fragrance. Vanilla isn't listed, but I think the sweetness might have won it for it. So yeah, Jardin de Misfa by Une Nuit Nomade is the number 1 fragrance this year. So finally, let's look at the number 1 perfumer. So last year, of course, we had success from Quentin Biche. So who's going to triumph this year? So when I looked at the top 10 and even the wider list, again, it was Quentin Biche. He had Delina Exclusive, he had Valea, and he also has Guidance and Guidance 46. So he's really done very well again this year, and he retains his title as the top perfumer. So thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed the video, then please press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know, are you shocked by this result? Were you expecting Une Nuit Nomade to triumph, or were you expecting another brand to win? How do you feel about Guidance being deposed? Are you a Guidance fan or not? And did you expect another fragrance to be in this list that you haven't seen? What's missing? So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.